So these first few videos, we're going to look at exactly what a manager does. So in terms of setting objectives for a business, or understanding what's going on in a business, understanding how well an organization is performing, how a manager leads people, how they motivate people, how they make decisions, and also how they check to see if those decisions are correct. We're going to look at different leadership styles. So we know that not all managers act in the same way, and there are certain ways that we can categorize those. And there are also some theorists that we look at, and those theorists come up with some models as to how managers work. So we look at the Tannenbaum and Schmidt model, and we also look at the Blake-Mouton grid. What we'll think about is all those different influences on management and leadership styles, and we'll also think about how effective they are in different situations. So the way that I like to start these videos though is usually with some key terms. So any terms that you might not have come across previously that will help you understand the video, or any other terms that you might have heard but there are specific definitions that we need to be okay with. So the advice that we have here is in your definitions book, we need to copy these down so you've got your own version of them ready at hand so you can revise from them. And when we give you specific definitions like that, we do need them in these words because that's what the exam board is looking for. So the first one, leadership. This is deciding on the direction for a business or a department or a functional area. Now, where we've got department here and where we've got functional area, they're specific things that we're going to look at, but essentially it's how the business is split. So if you think of the business as a whole circle, we break down the business potentially into 4 different functional areas. So they might be human resources, so the people in the organization. They might be finance, operations, so where things are made, and marketing, getting people to know about our products and finding what people want. So what we mean by departments and functional areas is just breaking that business down into smaller chunks. We do a lot more on that in detail though. It could be setting objectives that reflect this direction and inspiring and motivating staff to achieve these things. So leadership isn't just deciding what the business needs to do, it's also getting other people to help them to achieve them. Management is getting things done by planning, organising and coordinating people and resources. So leadership is very much about inspiring people and deciding on what to do. So deciding on the direction. Management is actually getting those things done. So what do actually managers do? Well, business managers perform a wide range of activities and have many different responsibilities depending on what type of business they work in. But there are common elements to the role of a manager in any business. So these include these 5 things I've put here. So setting objectives, analysing, leading, making decisions and reviewing. We're going to look at each of those 5 in a little bit more detail now. So in terms of setting objectives, you look separately at why objectives are set and also common business objectives that are common to all businesses or most of businesses. You'll also look at in detail how those objectives work, why they might not work. But we just need to be aware when we're thinking about managers is that they might set objectives or aims for the business, for the whole business, or back to those 4 functional areas again. So the manager, depending on how powerful they are in the organisation, how high up in the organisation, they might set objectives for a whole business that everyone has to follow, or a little bit lower down in the organisation, they might be in charge of marketing, they might be in charge of operations, finance, or human resources. So depending on what level the manager is at, they might set different objectives. In terms of analysing, we're thinking about analysing data or information. It's a really important function that managers do. So things like analysing the likely costs and demand of changes to various external factors, but that's something else again we'll look at in a different video. Managers in different functional areas again will need to analyse and interpret data in order to determine appropriate strategies. So, for example, a marketing manager will need to analyse and interpret marketing data before deciding what marketing strategies to pursue. Once again, we'll look at that in more detail when we look at marketing in particular, but just be aware that one of the things that managers do is look at data to decide on things like how much things are costing or how much demand there's going to be for your product, and based on the costs and based on demand, they'll decide what needs to be done next. So another thing that managers need to do is leading staff, which is really crucial. That's something we're going to focus on for the rest of this video in terms of management and leadership styles, what influences these styles, and how effective each of the styles might be in a different situation. Next up, in terms of what managers do, quite simply, is making decisions. Making decisions is one of the overall themes of the year. We have to think about how managers actually make these decisions. What is it that they do in order to make decisions? What things do they take into account? And what things are going to influence their decisions? So if you think about a typical decision might be to launch a new product, what things are going to change their mind? So it might be things like what their competitors do. It might be whether they think people are going to buy that product. So the decision that has to be made is to launch a new product. The thing that might influence them could be how much money they've got and what their competitors might do. Again, that might be on a whole business viewpoint if you are high up in the organisation, so it might be the whole business. Or the further down you come in the organisation, it links back to these functional areas again. So marketing managers will have to make decisions relating to marketing. Operations managers will have to make decisions relating to operations, finance, human resources. And then the last one we mentioned was reviewing as well. So reviewing the impact of these decisions and reviewing the impact of the strategies we put in place because of the decisions that we've made, it's something again that a manager needs to do. They need to determine whether those strategies or decisions have been successful and whether they need to be adjusted. So that's a key element of what a manager needs to do. And again, we need to relate that back to the 4 functional areas. So we'll look at that when we look at the functional areas in a little bit more detail. So let's look at the difference between managers and leaders. There'll be a few times when we talk about words, like I said previously, that you'll have heard before you've studied business studies that have a slightly different meaning when we're in the business studies class. So managers and leaders essentially are the same thing, but we have to be aware that they have different skills, different qualities, and they are appropriate in different ways. So the distinction between managers and leaders is sometimes seen as the difference between being risk averse or risk seeking. So managers are often thought to be relatively risk averse. So they seek to avoid risk, they seek to avoid conflict wherever possible to try and run a happy ship. Leaders, on the other hand, are thought to be risk seeking. So when pursuing their vision, leaders are assumed to consider it natural to encounter problems and hurdles that must be overcome in the way. So therefore, they have to be quite comfortable with risk. They see that options that others think are too risky, they see as potential opportunities, and they will happily break the rules in order to get things done. There is a saying that leaders seize opportunities, so they seize and seek opportunities, whereas managers simply avoid or avert threats. One of the things I still remember as a way of remembering the difference between managers and leaders is managers do things right. Leaders do the right thing. So leaders think about where the business should be, what the business should be doing, so they decide on the right thing, whereas managers put those things into practice. So it might be that a leader decides that a business needs to be more ethical, so it needs to look after its suppliers or its customers a bit more. It will be the manager's job to work out how to actually do that. So for all that there is a distinction between managers and leaders, it's not the case that one role is more important than the other. both skills are absolutely needed. So in order to be successful, both management and leadership are required. So for example, if you think about really successful entrepreneurs, people like Alan Sugar or Richard Branson, they've created opportunities for their business by being leaders. However, such opportunities have needed the skills of managers lower down the organisation who can turn those leadership ideas into reality. So if you think at the top, you had Richard Branson. He came up with, this is me trying to draw a light bulb, that's great. So he came up with the idea, and then somewhere further down the organisation, that someone had to decide how to turn that idea into reality. So the leader, the person at the top, came up with the idea. The manager, someone lower down the organisation, decided how to turn that into reality. So management skills can be seen as part of being a leader. So people who want to lead but not manage might have wonderful ideas, but without the ability to plan and oversee the necessary work, their ideas might not be realised, or certainly not by them. So if Richard Branson was a leader and he didn't have any managers working for him, he would have to try and develop some management skills. He would have to try and develop some management skills in order to get those jobs done, or he would have to employ a manager who can turn his ideas into something that actually can work. So if their ideas, if the ideas of a leader are implemented, it will be done by someone who has more developed management skills. However, whilst management skills are part of what's needed to be a strong leader, it's not always the case that the reverse is true. So that there are many people who are very skilled at being a manager, at turning other people's vision into a reality, but who aren't leaders themselves, so they don't necessarily come up with the ideas. So you can be a manager without being a leader, but you can't really be a leader without being a manager unless you've got people working for you who can do the managing. So therefore, most large organisations, management and leadership are interdependent. So there's a good word for you. Interdependent. So they rely on one another. So leaders and managers must work effectively with each other in order for the business to successfully achieve its objectives. So let's think about the types of management and leadership styles. We said we could categorize them. So management leadership styles are concerned with the way, the manner, the approach that the head of an organization or the manager or the leader has towards his or her staff. So a manager or a leader's manner will affect the leader's personal relationship with employees. For example, some leaders will inspire loyalty. So by looking after their staff feel as though they need to stay with their leader, with their manager, so they'll do things that perhaps they might not have done otherwise. Some might get the job done purely through fear. Management leadership style will dictate to the extent how much delegation takes place. Delegation, if you think about it, is a manager at the top of an organisation or in a functional area, let's think about that phrase all the time, ask someone beneath them, such as a supervisor, to do some of a task. So it might be that a manager has thought that some training needs to take place. So rather than the manager training the staff, they delegate that responsibility to the supervisor. So depending on a manager's style, they might want to delegate more or less to the supervisor. Similar thing with consultation. So consultation is where managers take into account the views of their employees, the people beneath them in the organisation structure. So if you have one particular style of management, you might want to consult your employees a lot. If you have another particular type of management, you won't want to consult them at all. So we can categorise those styles. So there are 4 main categories of management and leadership for the purposes of what we're going to do here. And we can do those categorisations in terms of personality. So the first one we'll look at is authoritarian. leadership. You might also see it called autocratic or dictatorial. They all mean the same thing, but just for the purposes of you, in case it comes up in an exam or a case study, those three things essentially mean the same. The next one we'll look at is paternalistic. Then we'll look at democratic and laissez-faire. Those are the way that we categorize a leader's style or a management style depending on their personality. But we can also do it in terms of the way that they respond to their workers or the way that they think about how a worker should act or does act. And that's one of the theories we're going to look at, which is McGregor's Theory X and Theory Y approach. Now, there are going to be a lot of theories that we look at in business studies, and the whole point of that is actually to make your life easier. So rather than having to remember loads of different what can often be disparate or ideas that don't necessarily work together, if we remember the model or if we remember the theory, it helps us then categorize lots of different ideas that we might have. So don't be put off when we introduce these theories. They're actually there to help you. So let's look first at this McGregor's theory of how managers think about their own workers. So Douglas McGregor, he was an American psychologist who conducted research into the attitude of managers to workers. So this isn't categorizing the workers themselves. Don't fall into that trap. As an examiner, I see a lot of times where students have got the theory right, but they're applying it slightly incorrectly. They think it talks about the workers themselves. It's not. Don't fall into that trap. As you can see, it's what they think about workers. So what do managers think about workers? So he wrote a book called The Human Side of Enterprise, which was first published in the 60s. He suggested that a manager's approach to workers can be grouped in two ways. So Theory X or Theory Y. Now, the way that I used to remember that at university is X's are usually bad. They're usually bad things, and a Y stands for yes, a good thing. So if we think that Theory X are all the negative things that managers think about their workers, and Theory Y are often positive things. So McGregor found that the majority of managers assumed that their workers did not enjoy work, they did not want to work, and were only really motivated by money. He termed this type of manager with this type of approach a Theory X manager, and he noted that it was often self-fulfilling. So, if you think of it like this, if I assume my workers are lazy, then I'll probably treat them quite badly. If I treat my workers quite badly, then they probably won't want to work for me, so they come across as being quite lazy. So what McGregor was saying was, if you know as a manager, or if we can see a manager as a Theory X manager, that can be quite a negative thing. It can be quite self-fulfilling, it can be quite demotivating for employees, and it can be quite bad for the organisation. So in general, Theory X managers think that workers are lazy, they dislike work, and are motivated by money. They need to be supervised and controlled, or they won't work, or they will underperform. They have no wish or no ability to make decisions or to take on responsibility. So if you think again in terms of it being self-fulfilling, if I think someone who's working for me has no ability to make decisions, I won't let them make decisions. I won't give them the choice to make decisions. So how is that worker ever going to get better at making decisions? So it's self-fulfilling. Because I don't believe they have the ability, I won't give them the opportunity. Because they haven't been given the opportunity, they'll never develop the ability. McGregor also said that Theory X managers think that workers have no interest in the needs of the organisation, and they also lack ambition. So this is quite an authoritarian approach in which the managers tells workers what to do and supervises them while they're doing it. Such an approach can be quite useful in a crisis or in organisations which are constantly changing or with lots of part-time workers who will need clear instructions and clear supervision. So if, for instance, we often use military examples to look at leadership. If there was a crisis in terms of there was a war going on and it was going badly, it might need a leader to come in and just tell people exactly what's going on. So there are situations when this Theory X management might work. The alternative approach, which McGregor saw was a minority view, so much less managers had this approach, was what he called this theory Y, which is when managers assumed that workers wanted to work, that they enjoyed working. They wanted to contribute their ideas. They wanted to gain satisfaction from their employee. So the opposite this time is that theory Y managers assume that workers, as I say, they enjoy work and they seek satisfaction from it. That workers will organise themselves, so they don't need really strict supervision, and they will take responsibility if they're trusted. If they're given the responsibility, they will live up to it. Poor performance is likely to be due to the work that a person has as being boring or monotonous, but it also could be down to poor management. So what McGregor's saying, in the theory Y organisation or theory Y manager, the manager recognises that if they're not doing something right, that's going to have an impact on performance. Workers wish to and should be given the opportunity to contribute to decisions. So theory Y managers, McGregor found out that they take on board the experiences of employees. Those experiences are valuable. The employees, the people who are doing the job, they understand the job the best, so they should be able to make decisions based on that. So this is the opposite of the theory X in terms of that was authoritarian. This is very much a democratic approach in which the manager delegates responsibility and authority and therefore involves staff much more in decision making. We'll look at that in a little bit more detail, but that in itself can be a problem. When we involve more people in decision making, it can become slower because we've got to ask lots of people their opinions. So that's how we would do it in terms of categorising a leader's approach or thoughts about staff. But now let's look at what I said about their personality. Let's look at that authoritarian idea first. So with authoritarian management and leadership styles, power and control and decision making are all kept at the top of the organisation. So if you think of an organisation being like a triangle, so at the bottom you've got lots of workers, and as you're going up you might have a few supervisors, then you might have those managers of the 4 functional areas that we're talking about: marketing, finance, HR and operations. Then at the top you might have one person who's in charge. If it's an authoritarian organisation, that one person at the top likes to keep all of the power, all of the control and all the decision making. All of the communication with the rest of the workforce tends to be one way and it's top down. So it's the person at the top telling people beneath them this is what's going to happen. It's one way communication. There isn't anything coming back up the other way. So it's not the people at the bottom saying, why don't we try this? Why don't we give this a go? Because the person at the top, A, doesn't give the opportunity for that and wouldn't listen anyway. Authoritarian leadership, as we said before, is also known as autocratic or dictatorial. So think of it from history. Think of dictators, people like Hitler or Saddam Hussein. They were authoritarian. They said what happened and it had to happen. This style of management and leadership links to the something that we call the produce or perish leader in the Blake and Mouton grid. We'll look at that in the next video. But what I mean by produce or perish is you either do it, I'm asking, you produce something, or you perish, you go, you're gone. So it's very much setting quite a negative tone to the organisation. Do what I want, or you're gone. Most decisions are made by the leaders who give out orders rather than consulting the workforce or delegating responsibility down the hierarchy. There's those 2 words again, consulting and delegating. These are real themes of management and leadership. Consulting, remember, is asking for opinions. Delegating is passing down of authority to people beneath you in the organisation structure. So in authoritarian management, there's very little consulting, if any, and very little delegation, if any. Authoritarian leaders also tend to follow a very formal, strict structure with strict controls. So if you think that if you have a part-time job, you might know that you lie here in the organisation structure, you have a supervisor here who has another supervisor here, and the manager's right at the top. In a formal organisation, you'll be expected to go through those chains of control, those chains of command. You wouldn't be expected to talk to the manager directly. You would probably get in trouble if you did. You'd have to go through these very formal structures. So it can cause problems with communication. It can make communication slow. It can mean that people feel demotivated. They don't feel as though they're given enough influence or input in the organisation. So this style of management and leadership may happen because leaders have little confidence in the ability of their staff, or simply because the leaders are unable to or don't want to give up power or control. So it can be it can often reflect that a leader feels a little bit uncomfortable that they might lose control of the organisation. It may also, however, reflect significant pressures on the organisation that force the leaders to make rapid and difficult decisions. So, for instance, in a crisis or an emergency, authoritarian approaches can be very effective because there are clear lines of authority resulting in clear decisions. So again, because there aren't people just talking to each other left, right and centre, this person makes the decision and these people do what they're told. So if it's a case of there's a financial problem in the organisation, authoritarian management can actually be quite useful in that sense. But it can cause frustration and resentment because the system is so dependent on the leader, and because of the non-participation of the workers in the decision-making process, these workers can feel demotivated. One thing you've got to think about as well is if all the power and all the leadership and all the management and all the control is coming from this person, what happens if that person goes? What happens if that person is ill? What happens if that person suddenly dies? Then all of the control and the decision making in the organisation's gone. It's like the head of an organisation has been taken away. So that can be a bit of a worry as well if we're purely focused on one person's authority in an organisation. Authoritarian leaders tend to have this McGregor's Theory X approach, so what we've just looked at there. And it uses rewards for good behaviour. So almost like a pat on the head, you've done what I've told you to do, well done. But it will use penalties for poor performance. So it goes back to that idea of produce or perish. It supports the ideas of F.W. Taylor. Now, depending if you've done any business before or if you've done any reading, you might have heard of someone called F.W. Taylor, but if you haven't, don't panic whatsoever. He's a theorist, so someone who's done lots of research into what motivates people. We will look at what motivates people again in great detail, so don't panic if you don't know who Taylor is, but if you do, then this kind of authoritarian leadership links with him. The next one we're going to look at is paternalistic. So paternalistic management or paternalistic leadership is a style in which employees are both consulted in decision making, but that actual decision still lies at the top. So yes, I'm going to ask your opinion, but I still make the decision. I still have the overall control as the manager or as the leader. It's essentially an approach where leaders decide what is best for their employees. So if you think about it, as the name implies, this style is very similar to the approach that parents take with their children. So your mum and dad might ask you what you want to do, they might take that into account, but ultimately they make the decision. So the workforce is treated like a family, so there's close supervision, but real attempts are made to gain the respect of employees and to get employees to accept what's going on. And decisions are intended to be in the best interest of the employees, and leaders really try to get that across to their staff. In organisations with this type of leadership style, workers do tend to recognise that leaders are trying to support their needs. They're trying to help. It's really important for paternalistic managers to make sure that their staff see this. It only really works if the staff understand that their needs are being looked at. This really it's another type of authoritarian management, but this time the leaders are trying to look after what they perceive to be the needs of their subordinates. They're not giving the subordinates any real freedom, but they are taking their needs into account. Leaders are more likely to explain the reasons for the decisions than a true autocratic or authoritarian approach, and they still might consult them before making a decision, but still, this time, delegation is still not going to be encouraged. So just to remind you, there's probably still no delegation. We might ask for consultation, we might take into account people's ideas. So yes, there's some consultation, but no delegation. This type of leadership links closely to another theorist called Mayo, and part of it links to Maslow. Again, if you haven't come across these, don't panic whatsoever, because we do whole sections on these, but if you have, this is where paternalistic links in with those. Let's look at democratic leadership now. So democratic management and leadership is a management and leadership style that involves two-way communication. So if you remember the little diagram I drew before with the person at the top and all the employees at the bottom, this time the manager might tell the people at the bottom what needs to happen, but the people at the bottom might also have the opportunity to say what works well and what doesn't work well, to be involved in the process. So it's two-way communication. This time there may well be considerable delegation. So people lower down the organisation might get the opportunity to do jobs that take a little bit more responsibility. A democratic management and leadership style follows the opposite approach in McGregor. It's the Y theory this time. Two-way communication provides opportunities for the workforce to be fully involved in the decision-making process. So not just every once in a while someone asking your opinion. Whenever a decision is made, you're involved in it. A democratic leadership style means running a business or one of those functional departments, remember, on the basis of decisions that are agreed by the majority. So everyone's view is taken into account. Democratic leaders not only delegate, but they also consult others about their views, and they also take these views into account before making the decisions. But that means in some situations that you might have to actually vote on an issue. But this is more likely to mean that leaders delegate a great deal, they discuss issues, they act on advice and explain the reasons for a decision. So rather than one person making a decision, it's like the whole organisation making a decision. So think about that, the phrase that people sometimes use about 2 heads are better than one. So a democratic leader would agree with that. They want the ideas of lots of different people rather than just making the decision themselves. A major advantage of democratic leadership is that the participation of workers in all these decisions allows input from people with lots of different skills and knowledge. So it might lead to better morale, and it also might mean that the decisions that are made are better. But the decision process might be slower because of the need to consult and discuss with so many different people, and there might be a concern as to where the power actually lies. So who's the person in control? Is it all the employees, or is it the manager? And is that loss of control dangerous? Again, if you've done anything like this before, you might have heard of these theorists Maslow and Hertzberg. This is where it links into democratic. Again, don't panic if you haven't heard of these. We will look at those in much more detail later on. And the final one is laissez-faire management. So a lot of people struggle with how you pronounce that. So laissez-faire. This type of style is a management style that abdicates responsibility. So it gives up responsibility and essentially takes a hands-off approach. It's an approach where the leader has minimal input in the decision-making process and essentially leaves the running of the business to the staff. Now that sounds really rather scary if you think that the whole point of a leader or a manager is to use their skills and expertise, but a lot of managers take that approach. The term comes from the French, as you might have guessed, and it basically means let it be or to leave alone. So laissez-faire, let it be, or leave alone. And that's exactly what's happening. The manager is leaving the organisation alone to run itself. So delegation, because of that, has to happen. So in the sense that decisions are left to the people lower down in the hierarchy, but such delegation therefore might lack focus or coordination. Because the leader's kind of washing their hands of the decision, they're not taking any part in the decision, who's to say that the decisions that are being made lower down the organisation are actually going to help the business achieve what they want to achieve? So this style might come about as a result of poor or weak leadership and a failure to provide all the frameworks necessary for a democratic approach. So we did democratic previously. So if that doesn't work, if too much responsibility is given to people down the organisation, it can lead to this laissez-faire style of management where nothing actually gets achieved because there isn't enough structure, there isn't enough of a framework for decisions to be made. For all it can happen accidentally, in some organisations it's a conscious decision for managers to take a hands-off approach and to give the staff the maximum scope to use their initiative and demonstrate their capabilities. Google's a really famous example of this, whereby they really want to take on board exactly the skills and the ideas of their workers in any level of the organisation. However effective it's going to be, though, depends on the staff themselves. Some may love the freedom to use their initiative and to be creative and to be given that responsibility, but others might really hate how unstructured their job is and the fact that they've got responsibility that they might not necessarily have asked for. It can be a really effective style when employees are highly skilled and experienced and educated, and when they take pride in their work and have the desire to do it successfully on their own. So it might be that the manager knows that they want to follow a laissez-faire style approach, and because of that, when they're recruiting new employees, when they're getting new employees into the organisation, they look for employees who like that, who are highly skilled and educated, and who want to make decisions on their own. The style is less effective when it makes employees feel insecure, when it makes them feel as though they're out on their own, that they have to make their own decisions. When leaders fail to provide regular feedback to employees on how well they were doing, so it feels as though they're left to fail on their own. And it's also less effective when leaders themselves don't understand what they need to do and are hoping that employees can do it for themselves. So it can often be that an ineffectual manager, a poor manager, takes a laissez-faire style approach because they know that they're a poor manager, so they're hoping that people can do their job for them. So in terms of the actual personalities, those are the four that we need to look at. We've looked at one of the theories of how one theorist, McGregor, thought that managers think about their staff, and that's all we're going to look at for this video. The next one we're going to look at are these continuums, if you like, or theories that draw all these together. So we'll look at what we call the Tannenbaum and Schmidt continuum of leadership, and also that Blake-Mouton grid. So we'll relate back to some of these autocratic, democratic, laissez-faire and paternalistic. But as a starter, this is all we need to understand, that there are essentially four different personality types. Those personality types will impact on how managers react to staff and how staff react to them. And those personality types can either fall into theory X or theory Y. Now you'll notice in some of our presentations we put these tips from the top in. We do this because we have experience as being examiners, so we get to see lots of different papers, we get to pick up lots of different tips from lots of people, often people who write the exams. So we'll put these little tips in just for you to be aware of as we're going through the course. So we haven't done motivation yet, but just when we do, we need to be aware that leadership and motivation are very closely linked. So when we come to write exam questions, whenever we're talking about leadership, let's see if we can link it to motivation. That will get you much better analysis marks because you're showing that one thing has an impact on another. So remember that leadership is closely linked to motivation. Remember this, that when we come in to do motivation in greater detail.